There's a moment that happens quietly in a person's life. So quietly, most people don't even realize it's happening. You wake up in the morning. Your alarm goes off. You reach for your phone before your eyes are even fully open. You scroll messages, notifications, other people's lives. And for a few seconds, you forget about your own. Then the day begins. You get out of bed, get ready, maybe you rush a little, maybe you don't, but there's already a certain feeling in your body, like you're tired before anything has even started. It's Monday, but if you're being honest, it doesn't really feel that different from Tuesday or Thursday or last year. You go to work, you say the right things. You do what you're supposed to do. You handle responsibilities. You check the boxes. You move forward. And from the outside, everything looks fine and nothing is falling apart. Nothing is obviously wrong. But somewhere in the background of your mind, there's a quiet question you try not to look at for too long. Is this really it? At some point, I started noticing that question more often. Not in big dramatic moments, not when everything was going wrong, but in the small ordinary spaces of life, when there was nothing to distract me. Driving home, sitting alone, finishing a long day and realizing tomorrow would look almost exactly the same. It wasn't that my life was bad. That's what made it harder to understand, because everything was okay and yet something felt slightly off, like I was moving forward, but not in a direction that actually meant anything to me. And then I came across a truth that was uncomfortable at first, but impossible to ignore once I saw it clearly. The problem isn't that you're lost. It's that you might be living a life you never actually chose. Because if you really look at it, a lot of what you call your life was shaped long before you ever questioned it. What success is supposed to look like, what a good life should be, what you're supposed to want, school, career, stability, approval. None of these are bad. But very few people ever stop and ask, is this actually what I want? So they continue. They follow the path. They do what works. They build something that makes sense but doesn't feel like theirs. I've seen people do everything right. They get the degree. They land the job. They build the life they were told would make them happy. And still they feel something missing. Not because they failed, but because deep down they were chasing a version of life that didn't belong to them. And maybe a part of you already knows this. Not clearly, not in a way you can easily explain, but in small moments. When things get quiet, you feel it. That sense that something about your life doesn't fully match who you are. Because deep down, you don't just want a life that looks good. You want a life that feels right, a life that is actually yours. Not impressive, not approved, not expected, just real. And the truth is, you don't build a life that matters by doing more of what everyone else is doing. You build it by starting to question what was never truly yours in the first place. That's where everything begins. Not with motivation, not with sudden change, but with awareness, sir. Because once you start seeing clearly, you begin to notice the patterns, the habits, the decisions you've been repeating without thinking. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. In this video, we're going to break down why most people never figure out what they truly want. Why they stay stuck in lives that feel almost right but never fully. And how to start building a life that actually feels like yours. Not perfectly, not all at once, but honestly, starting today. Chapter 1. The invisible script controlling your life. There's something most people never realize about their life. Not because it's hidden, but because it's always been there, so constant, so familiar that it feels normal. From a very early age, your life started taking shape. Not through a single decision, not through something you consciously chose, but through a series of quiet influences. Your family, your environment, your culture, your school, each one adding a layer, each one shaping what you believe is right, what you believe is success, and what you believe your life is supposed to look like. At first, it seems harmless. Of course, you go to school. Of course, You follow instructions. Of course, you try to do well. You learn what gets rewarded. You learn what gets approval. And without realizing it, you begin to move in that direction. Then it continues. You choose a path, or at least it feels like you do. But if you look closely, the choices available to you were already influenced by everything that came before. What seems safe? What seems realistic? What seems impressive? And slowly your life starts forming around a script. Not one you wrote, but one you stepped into. It doesn't feel like control because nothing is forcing you. No one is telling you what to do every second of the day. But the direction is already there. Subtle, invisible, and incredibly powerful. You wake up. You follow routines. You make decisions, and most of them feel like yours. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A large part of your life is not the result of conscious choice. It's the result of unconscious continuation. You continue what you've been taught. You continue what's been modeled. You continue what feels familiar. Not because it's right for you, but because it's what you know. And the strange part is this kind of life can look completely fine from the outside. You can be responsible, productive, even successful. You can build something that makes sense but still feel disconnected from it. I remember a period in my life where everything looked like it was moving in the right direction. There were no major problems, no chaos, no crisis. But there was a quiet feeling I couldn't explain. A sense that I was doing everything correctly. And yet something wasn't fully there. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. But it kept showing up in small moments after long days in silences when there was nothing left to distract me. And the more I paid attention to it, the more I started to realize something I had never questioned before. What if this life I'm building is not actually mine? Not in a dramatic way, not like I was forced into it, but in a subtle way, a quiet misalignment. Because when you grow up inside a system, you don't see it as a system. You see it as reality. You believe that this is just how life works. You study, you work, you build, you maintain, and you keep going. But very few people ever stop to ask why this path, why this version of success? Why these goals? And more importantly, did I choose this or did I inherit it? Because there's a difference between choosing a life and simply continuing one. Most people never make that distinction. They move forward. They achieve things. They build identities around what they do. And over time they become deeply attached to a life they never truly examined. That's why change feels so difficult. Not because people lack discipline. Not because they lack intelligence, but because the life they're living feels like part of who they are. To question it feels like questioning themselves. So they don't. They stay where they are. Not because they love it, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity is powerful. Even when it's not fulfilling, even when it's not aligned, you can stay in a life that doesn't feel right for a very long time. Because nothing is wrong enough to force you out of it. That's what makes this kind of trap so difficult to see. It doesn't hurt enough to leave, but it doesn't feel right enough to stay. So you remain in between, moving forward but not really moving closer to something that matters to you. And over time this becomes your normal. You stop questioning. You stop noticing. You adapt until one day something shifts. It doesn't always come from a big event. Sometimes it's just a moment, a quiet realization, a pause long enough to see things clearly. And in that moment, you begin to notice the patterns, the routines, the decisions, the direction your life has been taking. And for the first time, you see it not as your life, but as something you've been following. That's when the question becomes unavoidable. If I didn't consciously choose this, then what would I choose instead? And that question changes everything, because once you start asking it, you can't go back to not seeing. You begin to notice how many of your choices are based on expectation. How many of your decisions are shaped by what feels safe instead of what feels true. And slowly you start separating the two, what is yours and what isn't. This is where real change begins. Not with action, not with drastic decisions, but with awareness. Because before you can build a life that matters, you have to see the one you've been unconsciously living. You have to recognize the script, the patterns, the direction that was never fully yours. And most importantly, you have to be willing to question it. Not all at once, not perfectly, but honestly, because the moment you start seeing your life clearly is the moment you stop being controlled by it, and that's where everything begins. Chapter 2. Why you don't know what you truly want. If you ask most people a simple question, what do you really want? They will answer quickly, but if you listen closely, there is always a subtle hesitation underneath. Because the truth is most people do not actually know. They have ideas, they have preferences, they have things they think they want. But very few people have ever taken the time to sit with themselves long enough to understand where those desires come from. At first, this is difficult to notice because everything feels real. You see someone successful and something inside you reacts. You see a lifestyle, a career, a version of life that looks exciting and you feel drawn toward it. In that moment, it feels like a genuine desire, like something inside you is telling you this is what you want. But most of the time, what you are feeling is not desire. It is comparison. It is the quiet pressure of seeing what others have and wondering if you are falling behind. And that feeling is powerful because it does not feel like pressure. It feels like motivation, so you move toward it. You start shaping your life around it without ever asking if it actually belongs to you. This is how most people end up living lives that look right from the outside but feel empty on the inside. Because they are chasing something they never truly chose, they simply absorbed it from the world around them. You grow up surrounded by signals telling you what matters, what success looks like, what kind of life is worth building. You see it in the way people talk, in the way success is celebrated, in the things people admire. And slowly, without realizing it, you start to internalize those ideas. You begin to want what you have been taught to want, not what you have discovered for yourself. That is why so many people reach a goal and feel nothing. They get the job they work toward. They reach the milestone they thought would change everything. And for a brief moment, there is excitement, but it fades quickly. And what replaces it is a quiet confusion. Because the thing they spent years chasing does not give them the feeling they expected. Not because there is something wrong with them, but because it was never truly theirs. I remember seeing someone I knew who had done everything right. They had the career, the stability, the lifestyle that most people would consider successful. And yet when you talk to them honestly, there was a sense of disconnection, like they were living a life that looked good but did not feel meaningful. And that is when something becomes clear. You can achieve almost or as anything and still feel like something is missing if what you are chasing does not come from you. Most people never question this. They assume the problem is that they have not gone far enough, that they need to achieve more, earn more, become more. So they keep going. They double down. They push harder. But the direction never changes. Only the intensity does. And that is why the feeling stays. Because the issue was never effort. It was alignment. When you are disconnected from what you truly want, more effort does not fix it. It just takes you further in the wrong direction. The difficult part is figuring out what you truly want requires something most people avoid. It requires silence. It requires stepping away from noise, from comparison, from constant input. Because as long as your mind is filled with other people's lives, other people's standards, other people's definitions of success, you will never hear your own. That is why it feels so unclear. Not because you have no desires, but because your real ones are buried underneath everything you have absorbed. And uncovering them takes honesty. The kind of honesty that asks uncomfortable questions. If no one could see your life, what would you choose? If no one could judge you, what would matter to you? If there was no pressure to impress anyone, what direction would you move in? Most people never sit with these questions long enough because the answers are not always convenient. They do not always fit the life you have already built. They do not always match expectations, and sometimes they require change. That is why it is easier to stay unclear, to keep following what feels familiar, to keep chasing what makes sense even if it does not feel right. But clarity does not come from thinking harder. It comes from seeing more honestly. It comes from recognizing which desires are yours and which ones you have inherited. And that distinction changes everything, because once you begin to see it, you start noticing patterns. You start noticing how often your decisions are influenced by how they will be perceived. How often your goals are shaped by what sounds impressive instead of what feels meaningful. And slowly you begin to separate the two. What you have been taught to want and what you actually want. This is not something that happens instantly. It takes time. It takes attention. It takes a willingness to question things you have never questioned before. But it is the only way forward, because you cannot build a life that feels right on top of desires that are not yours. And most people never realize that. They spend years chasing clarity without realizing that the first step is not finding answers. It is removing what does not belong. Because what you truly want is already there. It has just been covered by everything you thought you were supposed to want. And once you begin to see that clearly, everything starts to shift. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable way. Because for the first time, you are no longer chasing something. You are starting to recognize something. And that changes the direction of your life completely. Chapter 3. The dangerous comfort of a meaningless life. There is a version of life that feels safe, predictable, stable, and completely empty at the same time. Most people never question it because on the surface everything seems fine. You wake up, you go to work, you handle your responsibilities, you come home, you rest, and then you do it all over again. Nothing is broken, nothing is falling apart. There is no obvious reason to complain. And that is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because a life does not have to feel terrible to be wrong for you. It just has to feel slightly off in a way that is easy to ignore. At first, it is just a small feeling, something you notice for a moment and then push away. You tell yourself, this is normal. This is what life is supposed to feel like. You convince yourself that everyone feels this way and that it is just part of being an adult. So you keep going. You stay busy. You stay distracted. You fill your time, because as long as you are moving, you do not have to think too deeply. But the feeling does not disappear. It waits. It shows up in quiet moments when there is nothing left to distract you. When you are alone, when the day is over. When everything slows down just enough for you to notice it again. That subtle sense that something is missing. Not in a dramatic way. Not like your life is falling apart, but in a quiet, persistent way. Like something important is not there. And over time, you learn how to live with it. You adjust. You normalize it. You stop expecting anything more, because expecting more feels risky. It feels uncertain. It feels like it could disrupt everything you have built. So instead, you choose comfort. You choose stability. You choose what makes sense, even if it does not feel right. I remember a period where everything in my life looked exactly the way it was supposed to. There was structure. There was progress. There was a clear direction. And yet there was a quiet feeling underneath it all that I could not ignore forever. It was not loud enough to force change, but it was strong enough to create doubt. And that is the space where most people stay. Not unhappy enough to leave, but not fulfilled enough to feel alive. Just somewhere in between. And the longer you stay there, the more it becomes your normal. You stop questioning. You stop imagining anything different. You start to believe that this is just how life is. But it is not. It is just the version of life you have gotten used to. There is a difference between a life that is stable and a life that is meaningful. And most people choose stability without realizing what they are giving up, because stability gives you certainty. It gives you control. It gives you a sense of safety. But meaning requires something else. It requires honesty. It requires uncertainty. It requires the willingness to admit that what you have built might not be what you truly want. And that is a difficult thing to face because once you see it, you cannot pretend. You do not. Once you recognize that something is missing, you have to decide what to do about it. And that decision is uncomfortable because it forces you to choose between two things. What is familiar and what is true? What is safe and what is real? Most people choose familiar not because it fulfills them but because it protects them. It protects them from failure, from judgment, from the unknown. But it also keeps them stuck in a life that never fully feels like theirs. And that is the hidden cost of comfort. It does not destroy your life. It slowly disconnects you from it. You can spend years, even decades, living in a way that makes sense on paper, but never truly feels alive. You can build something that looks successful, but feels empty when you experience it. And the scariest part is you can get used to that feeling. You can adapt to it so well that you forget anything else is possible until something breaks the pattern. Sometimes it is a moment. Sometimes it is a realization. Sometimes it is just a question that you can no longer ignore. Is this really how I want to live? And once that question becomes real, everything starts to shift because now you are aware. Now you can see the gap between the life you are living and the life that would actually feel right to you. And that awareness changes everything. It does not immediately fix anything, but it removes the illusion. It makes it impossible to go back to living unconsciously because now you know. You know that comfort is not the same as fulfillment. You know that stability is not the same as meaning. You know that a life can look fine and still not be yours. And once you know that you are faced with a choice, you can continue and ignore what you feel, or you can start paying attention. And that is where the real shift begins. Not in action, not in drastic change, but in honesty. The kind of honesty that does not allow you to lie to yourself anymore. The kind that forces you to admit that something inside you has been trying to get your attention for a long time. And maybe this is that moment for you. Not a dramatic turning point, not a sudden transformation, just a quiet recognition that the life you are living might not be the life you actually want. And that recognition is more powerful than it seems because it is the first step out of a life that only feels comfortable and into one that actually feels real. Chapter 4. The shift. The moment you start questioning everything. There is a moment that does not look important but quietly changes the direction of your life. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. Most of the time no one else even notices it. But you do, because something inside you stops accepting things the way they are. It usually begins with a simple thought. A question that feels small at first but lingers longer than it should. Why am I doing this? Not in a casual way, not as a passing thought, but in a way that stays with you, that follows you through your day, that makes everything feel slightly different. You start noticing things you used to ignore. The routines, the conversations, the decisions you make without thinking, and for the first time, you begin to see them clearly. You notice how much of your life is automatic. How many things you do not because you chose them but because you never questioned them, and once that awareness starts, it becomes difficult to turn it off. I remember when this shift started happening for me. It was not a big event. There was no clear trigger. Just a series of small moments where something felt off, and instead of ignoring it, I paid attention. At first, it was uncomfortable because questioning your life creates uncertainty. It removes the sense of control that comes from following a familiar path. But at the same time, it creates something else, clarity. Because when you start questioning things, you begin to separate what is real from what is assumed. You start asking different questions. Not what should I do, but what do I actually want? Not what makes sense, but what feels true. And those questions are not easy because the answers are not always convenient. They do not always match the life you have already built. They do not always align with expectations, but they are honest. And honesty has a way of changing everything. This is the point where most people turn back. They feel the discomfort, the uncertainty, and they choose to return to what feels familiar because staying the same is easier. It requires less courage, less risk, less change. But something has already shifted. And even if you try to ignore it, you cannot fully go back to the way things were. Because now you see it. You see the patterns. You see the compromises. You see the parts of your life that do not fully belong to you. And that awareness creates tension, a quiet internal pressure between what is and what could be. At first, you may try to resolve it quickly. You may look for answers, for a clear direction, for a plan. But this phase is not about finding answers. It is about seeing clearly. Because before you can change your life, you have to understand it. Not the version you tell yourself, but the reality of how you are living. And that requires honesty. The kind of honesty that does not filter or soften things. You start noticing where you are staying out of habit, where you are choosing comfort over truth, where you are following expectations instead of your own direction. And slowly you begin to feel something you may not have felt in a long time. Ownership. The realization that your life is not something fixed, not something you are stuck in, but something you are actively participating in. That realization is powerful because it shifts the way you see everything. You are no longer just reacting, no longer just following. You are observing, you are choosing. Even if those choices are still small, they are different because they are conscious. This is where change truly begins. Not when you take action, but when you start seeing your life as something you can question. Because the moment you stop accepting everything as given is the moment you begin to take control. It does not mean everything changes immediately. It does not mean you suddenly have clarity or direction or certainty. But it means something important. You are no longer asleep in your own life. You are aware, and awareness changes how you move, how you think, how you decide. You start to pause before acting. You start to notice before reacting. You start to question before continuing. And those small shifts create a completely different path over time, because instead of moving automatically, you begin moving intentionally, and that changes everything. There is no single moment where everything becomes clear. No instant transformation. No perfect answer, but there is a clear difference between before and after. Before you were living inside the script. After you are starting to see it, and once you see it, you have a choice. You can continue following it, or you can start rewriting it. Not all at once, not perfectly, but piece by piece. Decision by decision, moment by moment. And that is where your life begins to become yours. Not when everything is figured out, but when you start choosing. Because the shift is not about changing everything. It is about no longer accepting everything. And once that shift happens, there is no going back. You may still hesitate. You may still feel uncertain. But you will never again see your life the same way. Because now you know that you are not just living your life. You are shaping it, and that realization is the beginning of everything. Chapter 5. What actually makes a life matter? At some point, after all the questioning, after all the quiet realizations, a deeper question begins to form. What actually makes a life matter? Not what looks impressive, not what sounds successful, but what truly feels meaningful when you experience it from the inside. Because for a long time, most people confuse these things. They build a life based on what is visible, what can be measured, what can be recognized by others. Money, status, achievements, progress. All of these things have value, but none of them guarantee meaning. You can have all of it and still feel like something is missing. That is because meaning is not something external. It is not something you collect or achieve or reach. It is something you feel when your life is aligned with who you actually are. That alignment is quiet. It does not always look impressive. It does not always stand out, but it feels different. I remember a moment when things in my life became simpler, not easier, but clearer. There were fewer things I felt I needed to prove, fewer things I was chasing, fewer expectations I was trying to meet. And for the first time, There was a sense of calm that did not come from having everything figured out, but from no longer pretending. That is when something becomes obvious. A life that matters is not a life that impresses people. It is a life that feels honest to you. It is built on choices that reflect who you are, not who you are trying to be. It is not about having more. It is about having what matters. And that difference is everything. Because when your life is built on things that do not matter to you, you're always chasing something, always trying to reach the next point. Always feeling like something is missing. But when your life is aligned, that constant pressure disappears. Not because everything is perfect, but because everything makes sense. You are no longer trying to escape your life. You are living inside it. And that feeling cannot be replaced by achievement or recognition or validation. Most people never experience this because they never redefine what matters. They inherit definitions from the world around them and spend their lives trying to live up to them. But meaning is not universal. It is personal. What matters to one person may mean nothing to another. That is why copying someone else's life never works. Even if it looks perfect, even if it seems successful, even if it checks every box, if it is not aligned with you, it will never feel right. And this is where most people get stuck. They know something is off. They feel the disconnect, but they keep trying to fix it by adjusting external things. A new goal, a new plan, a new version of success. But the problem is not what they are doing. It is why they are doing it. Until that changes, nothing else will. A life that matters is not built by doing more. It is built by choosing differently. Choosing what is true over what is expected. Choosing what feels right over what looks right. Choosing what matters over what impresses. And those choices are not always easy because they often go against what you have been taught. They require you to let go of things that once felt important. They require you to stop chasing approval and start trusting your own direction. That takes courage. Not loud, dramatic courage, but quiet, consistent honesty. The kind that shows up in small decisions every day. What you say yes to, what you say no to, what you continue, what you let go. Over time, those decisions shape your life. Not in a sudden way, but in a steady. Chapter 6. Why most people never get what they want. By this point, something has likely become clear. It is not that people are incapable. It is not that they lack intelligence or opportunity or potential. And yet most people never build a life that truly feels like theirs. Not because they cannot, but because they do not. And the reason is rarely obvious. On the surface, it looks like hesitation, procrastination, or lack of discipline. But underneath, there is something deeper. Most people are not afraid of failure. They are afraid of losing what feels familiar. Because even if a life does not feel right, it still feels known. And the known feels safe. You understand it. You know how it works. You know what to expect. And that creates a kind of comfort that is difficult to let go of even when it is not fulfilling. I remember noticing this in myself at a point where I could clearly see that something needed to change. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable way. There were things in my life that no longer felt aligned, but the idea of changing them felt heavier than staying the same. Not because change was impossible, but because it was uncertain. And uncertainty creates resistance. Your mind starts asking questions. What if this does not work? What if you make the wrong decision? What if you lose what you already have? And those questions are powerful because they feel logical. They do not sound like fear. They sound like caution. So you wait, you delay, you tell yourself you will figure it out later. But later becomes next month, next year, someday. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to choose comfort over truth. Not once but repeatedly in small decisions that seem insignificant in the moment. You stay in conversations you have outgrown. You continue routines that drain you. You move in directions that feel safe instead of ones that feel real. And over time those small choices create a pattern. A pattern of staying. A pattern of avoiding. A pattern of not fully choosing your life. Another reason most people never get what they want is because they are more focused on how things look than how they feel. They choose paths that make sense, that are respected, that are easy to explain because being understood feels safer than being authentic. But that comes at a cost. You begin to build a life based on perception, not reality. You start asking, what will people think instead of what do I actually want? And that shift moves you further away from yourself. There is also a quieter reason that is rarely talked about. People become attached to who they have been. They build identities around their choices, their careers, their paths, and over time those identities feel fixed. So even when something no longer fits, they hold on to it because letting go feels like losing a part of themselves. It feels like starting over. And starting over is something most people avoid. Not because it is impossible, but because it is uncomfortable. It requires humility. It requires uncertainty. It requires stepping into something that is not yet defined. So instead, they stay where they are and try to make it work. They adjust. They compromise. They tell themselves this is just how life is. But deep down they know. They know when something is not right. They know when something does not fit. They just do not act on it. Because action creates consequences. And consequences require responsibility. It is easier to stay in a life that does not fully satisfy you than to risk building one that might fail. But here's the truth that changes everything. You're already taking a risk. Every day you stay in a life that does not feel right. You're risking something. You're risking time. You are risking energy. You are risking the chance to experience a life that actually feels like yours. And that risk is invisible because nothing immediately goes wrong. But over time it adds up. You look back and realize you have been living on autopilot longer than you intended. That is how people wake up years later feeling disconnected from the life they built. Not because they made one wrong decision, but because they avoided many small ones. So the issue is not ability. It is avoidance. Avoidance of discomfort. Avoidance of uncertainty. Avoidance of truth. And until that changes, nothing else will. Because you cannot build a life that feels right while consistently choosing what feels safe. At some point, you have to face the tension between those two things. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic way, but in small honest moments where you stop asking what is easiest and start asking what is true. That is where things begin to shift. Because once you stop avoiding, you start seeing clearly. And once you see clearly, your choices begin to change. Not perfectly, not immediately, but steadily. And that is all it takes. Because a life that feels right is not built in one decision. It is built in the moments where you stop avoiding and start choosing. And most people never reach that point. Not because they cannot, but because they never allow themselves to. Chapter 7. Designing your life without starting over. By now you can see it. The patterns, the misalignment, the quiet gap between the life you are living and the life that would actually feel right to you. And naturally, a question begins to form. What do you do next? Most people think the answer has to be something extreme. Quit everything, start over, change your entire life overnight. But that idea is exactly what keeps people stuck because it feels too big, too risky, too unrealistic. So instead of moving forward, they do nothing and everything stays the same. But real change almost never happens that way. You do not rebuild your life in one decision. You shift it in a direction. And that direction is shaped by small, honest choices made consistently over time. It starts with something simple but uncomfortable. You begin to notice what drains you. Not in a dramatic way, but in quiet moments throughout your day. The conversations that feel forced, the routines that leave you empty, the commitments that no longer make sense. At first, you might ignore these things because they seem small, but they are not. They are signals, and most people spend years ignoring them. The next step is just as important. You begin to pay attention to what feels real, not what is exciting, not what is impressive, but what feels natural, what feels right without needing to be explained. It could be something small, a moment of focus, a sense of calm, a feeling of clarity. These moments are easy to overlook because they are not loud, but they matter because they point you in a direction, and that direction is yours. Not something you copied, not something you were told to want, something you actually experience. The mistake most people make is waiting for certainty. They want to be sure before they take a step, but certainty comes after movement, not before. So instead of waiting, you start small. You make decisions that are honest even if they are not perfect. You say no to things that no longer fit, even if it feels uncomfortable. You create space in your life, even if you are not sure what will fill it yet. This is where things begin to shift. Not because everything becomes clear, but because you are no longer moving blindly. You are choosing even in small ways. And those small ways matter more than they seem. I remember a time when nothing in my life changed on the surface. The same routine, the same responsibilities, the same structure, but internally something was different. I started paying attention. I stopped forcing certain things. I allowed myself to step back from what did not feel right, even when there was no clear alternative. And over time that created space. Space to think, space to notice, space to move in a different direction without needing to destroy everything I had built. That is something most people misunderstand. You do not need to burn your life down to change it. You need to adjust how you are living inside it. You need to stop reinforcing what is not aligned and start giving attention to what is. This is not fast. It is not dramatic. It does not look impressive from the outside. But it works because it is real. You are not chasing a new identity. You are uncovering your actual one. And that process takes time. There will be moments where you doubt yourself. Moments where it feels easier to go back. Moments where staying the same feels more comfortable. But those moments are part of the process, not a sign that you are doing something wrong. The difference now is that you are aware. You notice when something feels off. You recognize when you're acting out of habit instead of intention. And that awareness gives you a choice. Each time you can continue the pattern or you can shift it even slightly. That is how direction changes. Not in one big decision, but in many small ones. Over time, those small shifts begin to compound. Your days start to feel different. Your energy changes. Your focus changes. The way you make decisions changes, and eventually your life begins to reflect those changes. Not because you forced it, but because you guided it. There is a quiet confidence that comes from this. Not the kind that needs to be seen or validated, but the kind that comes from knowing you are no longer living automatically. You are participating. You are choosing even when it is uncertain. Even when it is not perfect, and that is enough, because a life that matters is not built through perfect decisions. It is built through honest ones again and again until the direction becomes clear, until the life you are living starts to feel like it belongs to you. And when that begins to happen, you realize something important. You were never stuck. You were just moving without awareness. And now you are moving with intention. And that changes everything. Chapter 8. The moment you start living for real. There is no dramatic moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. No instant transformation. No point where your life finally feels perfect. That is not how it happens. Real change is quieter than that. It happens in a way that is almost easy to miss until one day you realize something is different. You wake up and the day does not feel as heavy. Not because your life is easier, but because it feels more honest. There is less resistance, less tension, less of that quiet feeling that something is not right. You begin to notice small things. The way you move through your day, the way you make decisions, the way you respond to things that used to drain you. And for the first time, it feels like you are not forcing your life. You are living it. I remember this shift not as a single moment, but as a gradual change. There was no big breakthrough, no clear turning point, just a growing sense that things felt different, simpler. Not because everything was figured out, but because I was no longer trying to be someone I was not. And that made everything lighter. There is a kind of freedom that does not come from having more, but from carrying less. Less expectation, less pressure, less need to prove anything. You stop measuring your life by how it looks to other people and start experiencing it for what it actually feels like. That changes everything because now your life is not something you are trying to manage. It is something you are connected to. You are present in it. You are aware of it. You are part of it. There will still be uncertainty. There will still be moments where things feel unclear. But those moments no longer feel like a problem. They feel like part of the process because you are no longer trying to control everything. You're allowing your life to unfold while still choosing your direction. And that balance is important. You are not drifting, but you are also not forcing. You are moving, but in a way that feels aligned. There is a quiet confidence that comes with this. Not loud, not visible, but steady. You trust yourself more. You listen to yourself more. You no longer need constant validation because you are no longer disconnected from what you feel. That does not mean everything becomes easy. You will still face challenges. You will still have doubts. But those things no longer define your experience. Because underneath all of it, there is a sense of clarity, a sense that even if things are not perfect, they are real. And that is enough. Most people spend their lives chasing a version of life that looks right. But the moment you stop doing that and start building a life that feels right, everything changes. Not on the surface, but at the core. Your life begins to belong to you. Not in theory, but in experience. You are no longer trying to fit into something. You are no longer trying to meet expectations. You are simply living in a way that reflects who you are. And that is what it means to start living for real. It is not about reaching a final destination. It is not about having everything figured out. It is about being present, being honest, and being aligned in the life you are living right now. There is a moment quiet and almost invisible where you realize you are no longer waiting. You are no longer hoping that someday things will feel right. You are already there. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to know you are on the right path. And that realization is more powerful than any achievement because it does not depend on anything external. It comes from within. It comes from the way you are living, the way you are choosing, the way you are showing up in your own life. And once you experience that, even for a short time, you understand something clearly. You do not need a different life. You need a life that is yours. And that is something you build. Not all at once, not without difficulty, but step by step with awareness, with honesty, with intention. Until one day, without even realizing when it happened, you are no longer searching. You are living. And that changes everything. There is something important to understand after everything you have just heard. Nothing in this video was meant to overwhelm you or push you into changing everything overnight because that is not how real change works. A life that matters is not built in one decision. It is built in awareness and then in small honest choices made consistently over time. If there is one thing to take from this, it is not that you need to figure everything out. It is simply this: pay attention. Pay attention to what feels off. Pay attention to what feels real. Pay attention to the parts of your life that no longer feel like they belong to you. Most people ignore these signals. They move faster. They distract themselves. They tell themselves they will think about it later, but later keeps getting pushed further away until years pass and nothing truly changes. You do not need to let that happen. You do not need to have a perfect plan. You do not need to know exactly where you are going. You just need to be honest enough to notice what is true right now. Maybe that means questioning something you have never questioned before. Maybe that means letting go of something that no longer fits. Maybe that means taking a small step in a direction that feels more real, even if it does not make complete sense yet. That is enough because direction matters more than speed. And honesty matters more than certainty. There will be moments where you doubt yourself. Moments where it feels easier to go back. Moments where staying the same feels safer. That is normal. That is part of the process. What matters is that you do not ignore yourself anymore. That you do not continue living unconsciously just because it is easier. Because the truth is, your life is already happening. Every day, every decision, every moment you choose to continue or to shift, you are building something. Whether you are aware of it or not. So the real question is not if your life will take shape. It already is. The real question is, will it be something you chose or something you simply continued? And that choice is always available. Not in a distant future. Not when everything is perfect, but now, in small ways, in quiet decisions, in moments where you decide to be honest with yourself. If something in this video resonated with you, do not let it fade away as just another idea. Take a moment, pause, look at your life, not from the outside, but from how it actually feels, and ask yourself, what is one thing you know is not aligned? What is one thing you have been avoiding? What is one small shift you can make starting today? You do not need to change everything. You just need to start. And once you start, even in the smallest way, something begins to move. Something begins to open. And that is how a different life begins. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but honestly. If this message stayed with you, if it made you think, if it made you see something differently, then you already know this is not something to ignore. Take it with you. Let it stay in the back of your mind. Let it shape the way you see your life. Because once you start seeing clearly, you cannot go back to not seeing. And that is where everything changes. Thank you for being here. And if you are on this path, even quietly, even slowly, you are already closer than you think.